Well, we didn't actually take questions during that session. Has anyone got anything, any burning desire?
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is the IET specific to the UK, or is it broader within Europe?
No, it's definitely a worldwide organisation. Worldwide involves its headquarters are in. They have they're in central London, and they have a huge office of staff just outside London with over 400 people there. But they have had headquarters all over Asia. So I even think there's a building in Hong Kong, I think in Japan. They certainly have. Thank you. They certainly have buildings in North America and others throughout Europe.
In terms of accreditation at the curriculum level, in terms of accreditation, if I understood you correctly, is that primarily in the United Kingdom, or is that worldwide as well?
I think again, I'm not entirely. I'm a professional member of the society, so as a qualified engineer, having taken a master's course within the UK and then developed as a member, I'm accredited. My degree that I took, for example, as a undergraduate student, which was one of, say, the 160 that is accredited within the UK by the Engineering Research Council and the IET, that I had to be able to take up chartered status as an engineer, in this case an electrical engineer. I would have had to take one of those courses within the UK, and as far as I'm aware, it's only, in terms of licensing and accreditation, it's only within the UK that exhibits. But then I think a lot of the don't quote me on this, but I believe that a lot of certainly the ex-Commonwealth countries probably use the same accreditation from the Engineering Research Council in the UK. So I would imagine that it goes beyond that in that respect, but not a direct connection. But certainly, while it is a global organisation, it has members throughout the world, predominantly in Europe and Asia. The licensing and the accreditation of the degrees is more UK based.
The professional practice.
Yeah. So I think, like, just speaking from a student point of view in the UK, when you take an engineering degree as such, and this doesn't go for the biological sciences at present, you would make sure that you selected a degree course that was accredited by one of the big engineering institutions based in the UK. And that has changed over the years to actually be a requirement was a 4-year course, and so that drove the change from a 3-year bachelor's course in the UK to a 4-year master's course. So you come out of a Master of Engineering, and within 2 years of professional practice, you can then apply for chartership as a chartered engineer. So that's something I don't know how that process works in the US and in other parts of the world, but certainly as a kind of as a student setting out on my career as an engineer, back when I was 18, 19, with the belief I was going to be an electronic engineer before I made the jump, that was one of my prime concerns, was that I would one day get chartership. And it's something that now I'm kind of, I guess I serve as a good example in the sense that, like, having finished an accredited degree course and then jumped into the biosciences, and now midway through a PhD in biological science, where do I go for accreditation? Where do I go to be rubber stamped and said that I am a professional engineer? And that's kind of at this point, I think, maybe a hazy subject, which is something that maybe the IET and the other global organisations could potentially address, specifically maybe the IB.
Well, what does that rubber stamp provide for you? I mean, I know that I'm not an engineer, but I believe that there's a similar professional engineer's exam you can take after, is it 5 years of having been an engineer in the U.S.? Yeah. So, from your position, what does that get for you, and why should that potentially be developed in a biological?
I think from the talk I had, like, as a career development point of view, it was kind of like it's the final step really to becoming an engineer. I think if I'd stayed, I used to work in the automotive industry right up until like midway through my college degree, and that was kind of, I saw myself as having graduated and finished the educational core of an engineering degree. I would then need to practice successfully for 2 years, and it's kind of it's one of the kind of like prerequisites to moving on and becoming a professional engineer. It's, you know, to gain chartership, I guess it's like being a chartered accountant or going to the bar in law. You need that, and it would be a roadblock in terms of where you would go in your career without that. It represents a commitment, I think, to profession that you're in, and that you're upholding those standards, and you're able to meet those standards within your professionalism. Maybe through, I don't know if there are any chartered engineers in the audience that could probably say a little bit more. Again, I've turned my attention away from it, having made the jump into life sciences, and I don't know if there's any, as a research scientist or as a a corporate scientist.
My question is, and maybe this is true in the UK too, but my sense is in the US, it's very discipline dependent. So I think in civil engineering, it's sort of almost a norm or an expectation that, so there's this value placed on getting that accreditation and being a professional engineer. But in other disciplines, I don't think it's as expected or valued as highly. Do you have a sense on that?
So in the United States in civil engineering, when you, to have an accredited undergraduate degree, you'll, in your senior year, take a course in professional practice, which includes things like engineering ethics. You know, if you're just building the foundation for that skyscraper and you see a crack, you know, do you spackle it over or do you go talk to somebody about it? Not to make light of it, but considerations as such. When you then complete your degree, you're eligible to take what's called an EIT exam, Engineer in Training. And then after some years of practice under the mentorship of a professional licensed engineer, you can then take your PE exam, your professional engineer exam. The history of this goes back to the late 1800s in civil engineering, when engineers were competing for public funds to support construction projects. And what they found is that the engineers were bad-mouthing one another in the bidding process. And from this arrived some of the early codes of engineering ethics, which namely had to do with don't badmouth your fellow engineers in a bidding process. This changed significantly with the revision of the codes of ethics in engineering having to do with the awareness of environmental issues in the 1960s. And so there's a big rewrite, for example, the American Society of Civil Engineers Code of Ethics, following Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring and so on. That put the public good paramount. And that's now more of the form of some of the licensing work. In the United States, for civil engineers then, it's only really required to be an engineer who signs off on drawings having to do with public works projects that are paid for by the public. In genetic engineering, there's not the equivalent of this to my knowledge. And I think it's both surprising and interesting to consider that this hasn't happened and to imagine the opportunity of saying, a good synthetic biologist, a good biological engineer in the future will sign their work. Whether this is the written document or in the DNA itself, this seems like a prudent practice to develop within a professional context. If for no other reason, you can imagine a more complicated future than the one we live in today, where a small number of people might eventually choose to misapply the biotechnology tools that we have. And if we have an open, constructive community which is defining best practice, allowing people to be within that community, defending that community, and kicking people out who are inappropriate in their behavior, that will prepare, I think, the rest of our society to recognize biotechnology as being part of a responsible profession. It's not that we're irresponsible today, by and large, but we don't have some of the social norms and mechanisms that would really strengthen this. And I think the IBE, the IET/bio/some combination would serve a tremendous role by taking this forward. The one thing I forgot to mention in my remarks, which would be something I'd love to shut down as a possible BBF initiative, is the idea of having BioBricks Pro, you know, like BioBricks professional membership. You are, by taking, you know, this exam, somehow approved to be working with BioBrick parts, by agreeing to uphold, you know, the ideals that you won't misuse BioBrick parts to cause harm, you'll become a licensed BB Pro, right? And if that could go somewhere else, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'd just like to add my comments to that. I think from a personal perspective, it's something that when I get asked what I do by my friends, my colleagues, my family, and I say, well, I'm a genetic engineer, and that instantly instills this kind of, I think, often this look of fear on their face as well because of the public, certainly in the UK and Europe, the public perception of what that means. And I don't know why. I think I constantly try and justify myself for what I do and look and talk about the positive aspects that come out of that. And I think that touch on what Drew said about the civil engineering course you might take, and at the end of that degree that you are expected to take a code of practice and go along with that. That would possibly move some way to reassuring the public in the years to come as they become more and more aware of the work that we're doing, that all of the qualified engineers out there have had to go through this reasonably stringent process of discussing and being educated in the ethics and social responsibility that comes with the work that we're hopefully going to be doing in time. I don't know whether you could possibly comment on that in terms of from an industrial perspective.
Yeah, I was actually just going to jump in on the question or the comment about the public awareness. I was at a release about a week and a half ago at the Woodrow Wilson Center in D.C., and they had outsourced a study through the Heart Foundation, and this is all available on the web. They've been doing for a number of years a lot of projects related with nanotechnology and risk assessment and public perception and doing focus groups and studies. And now they're reaching out into the new arena and taking on synthetic biology. And it was rather interesting to compare and contrast the public opinion and public perceptions of the nanotechnology versus synthetic biology. And there was quite a bit more awareness of nanotechnology. The public had heard the word, they had ideas, and so they were given focus groups, they were given information, they were polled before and after the information, is it good, is it bad, what do you think? And the striking thing with the synthetic biology is there was almost no awareness. So I think there's a great opportunity to frame the issues for the public now. And, I think that we're where nanotech was 5 or 6 years ago in that. And the other thing that I came away with from this release was that the perceptions that are out there are negative. The public seems to be afraid of the Franken-monster such, and I think we need to be cautious about that and promote what things will be in place, how we're going to handle these social issues that especially were raised in the session yesterday.
I was just curious if, kind of following up on what you just said, if that was in some ways a fallout of basically genetically modified corn and crops, if basically the public, is there any data to suggest that the public is really using those ideas to think about synthetic biology?
Yeah, I think that there's a direct correlation there.
So on the subject of student organizations, what are some of your ideas for types of activities? One thing that I'm just thinking about is I've seen students get together at workshops, and they seem to really thrive in that atmosphere where it's a student-run workshop.
Right.
Is that a possibility?
Yes, we do. I mean, we do organize workshops also, but it's basically catered to computational biology students, I would say. And okay, so my answer will be yes, we do. And our main focus is the annual symposium, and then we do cater to a couple of workshops. For example, last one was in collaboration with Cornell and Sloan Kettering, in which we pumped in like 10 different students from developing countries, basically, and put them in touch with different scientists, and a couple of them got offers for PhDs or their internships there. So yeah, that's what we do.
I could maybe just say a little bit about the bias. This is the Biases Bio event that John Cumbers, who's sat on front row, initiated, and we've carried on. It's quite an interesting one actually, because it started out entirely as a student-run event. Which maybe John, do you want to comment on it, on how it got started, and then we can talk about a little bit about how the IT got in, because it kind of serves as a reasonably interesting model to how a large institution has come in to support what was a student-run event. I don't know if you want to introduce Biases Bio.
Sure. I missed the first half of this session, so has it got some goals that we're trying to come up with, some plans or some ideas, or what is the goal of the session?
Well, we're really just having an open discussion. We've all talked about the different institutions that we represent, and we were just hoping to see, firstly, how we could potentially collaborate and learn lessons from each other in the different experiences that we've got, because there is quite a mix of backgrounds, but also just take questions from the audience and discuss those points. I think the goal would be ultimately to look at how we take this forward in terms of possibly a framework, how the organisations fit in with each other, mesh together, and also do we need potentially an umbrella organisation or at least a roadmap as to where things are going to fit together, with a view potentially to have a licensing of degrees, accreditation standards, and we're a very informal community, but with the possibility of these formal organisations, established institutions coming in and fitting into our goals as well.
Sure. So Biases By, I think, is the same as any other conference or meeting that gets together. It was just started by graduate students, and now it's as the conference gets older, it's now in its 4th year, and I guess the biggest challenge is trying to keep it for young people and keep it for graduate students, as the people who set it up maybe are not graduate students anymore. So trying to pass on the baton without it just becoming another conference like any other. So I think that's one challenge, is how to keep things for young people and students when you've got a continual turnover of people, and that's what I guess.
Well, that's what we've noticed, because it started out as a very informal, fun, entirely student-run event, right? Funded by the research councils in the UK, and then the IET came in and have put on the table there a huge resource in terms of organising events and stuff. But although that provides other problems of integration and how you fund that model, because you've got students coming, it still stands as a reasonably good way of putting on an event. So maybe we could move over to this idea of the SBN series, as Drew said, if it was to come to Europe, for example, and be hosted with the IET. Is that what you're potentially pushing, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do have a pretty crisp agenda. One is what the hell to do with this conference series here, and can it be organized in partnership with any of the other societies that exist, strengthening both as a result. Second agenda item would be, how do we organize the professional societies that they exist, or make new ones sufficient to advocate for things that need to happen, whether it is professional licensing and registration, or how about just a technology roadmap for construction of DNA, getting that supported by the industry associations and lobbied for at the federal level as needed. So let's come back to the first one. Is the IAT the right partner? If the Synthetic Biology Conference series, when it goes back to Europe, how do we figure that out? If you were doing diligence on a process like this, want to consider other organizations representing science and engineering in Europe? Would there be an organization for Asia that should be considered? Some of these questions are tactless and perhaps not best discussed in an open, public conversation. Vis-a-vis North America, one of the things I've experienced in bioengineering is the fact that there appear to be 5 or 6 inept professional societies in bioengineering, none of which has provided they're all nice sort of lifestyle organizations, but none of which has really risen to the position of leadership. How do you think about that, Christina, strategically? How do we fix that problem, or is it not a problem? And so on. So I'd love to either hear or offline get some pretty crisp answers. I don't know. Sorry if that's inappropriate.
So we haven't had a chance to talk about this much, but could you give us a ballpark figure of what the problem is in terms of how much funding is required to run this thing?
This conference here?
Yeah.
It's about a half a megawatt, 500K. Rising a little bit above that, but I really hope not too much.
So the other question, I guess, is how many man hours would you say, of the total amount of man hours? Of the total number of hours spent organizing this conference, what percentage was spent on fundraising, on basically getting the money in place?
I'd say about half. I'm less worried about the money. I'm more worried about, actually, John, some of your remarks having to do with the balance of the experience at the conference. The thing that blows me away about this conference is what's happening over in the poster sessions. right? And the number and quality of those posters and the sort of bottom-up innovation that's coming through that is remarkable. It's been one of the strengths of this conference series. And so I'm sort of resonating with what you said around the Biosys Bio meeting and how that was buy-in for the students. And I think one of the challenges for the synthetic biology conference series is to balance some, if you call them programmatic requirements, so be it. But I think there's actual technology issues that are sort of persistent ones that we want to have leadership prescribing some aspects of the conference, while at the same time marrying that to an architecture and infrastructure that supports inclusive, growth and bottom-up participation. That's the trickier part of the meeting. I think the money can be figured out so long as what's being done is the right thing to get to happen.
So, Drew, I think a lot of us would really very strongly agree with that sentiment that maintaining this bottom-up influx of ideas and enthusiasm. Has there been any discussion of combining the iGEM Jamboree with something like an annual SB conference? Yeah. Presumably at this point there are logistic issues, but the idea of it rotating from continent to continent and with iGEM as well would be interesting.
Yeah, so the iGEM event is extraordinary in its own way, and it's a little awkward this year because in coming to Hong Kong and with issues of weather, we chose to arrive here in October, just 1 month before the iGEM Jamboree. Normally these events would be out of phase, right, separated by 6 months. There have been very direct discussions to that point, and I think the consideration is that it would be about a week long as an event, and that it'd be too much. But maybe that's an incorrect conclusion, and it's the right thing to couple. Don't know. What would you say?
Well, I think just for various reasons. I think this conference I'd like more time to chat to people, to be honest. And so having iGEM as a focus in a way, or as a co-focus, would be essentially reflect the origins of the field in a way, and help define, why if we would be different from other conferences, and to capture that. So you'd have essentially in many conferences you have plenary sessions and you have workshops. Here you would have the enthusiasm of students on display as well. And they'd also not just, I think of the amount of effort that's going on now, almost 100 teams raising quite a large amount of money to send students. So they would also gain the benefit of hearing, essentially world leaders in the field talk and gain that experience at the same time as they'd gain the iGEM experience. So not, you wouldn't want to swamp iGEM. I don't think you would. I think it would be possible. It may be the other way around.
I think the timing there would be tricky for some of the undergrads because I know just with the team that so you typically want to do it after the summer, right? Because that's when they're getting most of the work done. So November is a good time, but they're in school, and so most of the undergrads can't take a week off, right? So I feel like most of the undergrad participants would still go for the weekend, but would have to return to classes. I don't know. That's my.
So when do your semesters start? For us, so September would be a possibility to avoid classes. Would that work for you guys? Or?
That wouldn't give iGEM enough time.
Well,
but what about winter break?
Then you're gonna. That's that again. I think would be hard for undergrads. I don't know. So I think it's interesting to consider coupling them into a week, but I still think a lot of the undergrads will still only go for the iGEM part. Because I know, just dealing with my students, they're super stressed to get back to their exams. And,
but they don't have to stay. I think for Europeans
okay.
especially.
I think that might be okay, but I just wouldn't expect the undergrad students to actually stay the full week.
Yeah. I think certainly from our point of view, the students have to travel a fair way to get to Boston anyway, so most stay over for a few days anyway, just for fun. So I think from our perspective, it would be no problem at all. And I think the extra benefit that you would gain from that would far outweigh missing a few boring lectures.
I think there are other issues base issues that you need to consider. Organizing a week-long event, from my personal experience with the ISMB and Student Council events, organizing a 7-day event for students to come and stay. They have to cover a lot of expenses, and I'm talking about the students from different countries, not just developed world. And every lab doesn't have a lot of resources for them to support students for a week-long affair. And you got to realize what kind of audience you're looking at. Is just iGEM teams, or you're opening it to the different students from different part of the world. So that's something we need to take into consideration also.
But in a way, having an international conference, it would be the premier conference in synthetic biology, that raises extra fundraising opportunities. And if you're raising money not just for the students to go to the iGEM Jamboree, but also to attend this and present at this conference,
that could potentially help, I
would
guess.
open some doors, I think.
So, Drew, if I'm not mistaken, there's like about 200 students attending this conference, and there's a significant amount of support raised for those students to come here.
Yeah.
But that's not currently modeled for iGEM.
Right.
I mean, not as much fundraising on the side of the organizing committee behind iGEM for the students. Much of that is done by each team, right?
Yeah, no, iGEM did a very good job. In the first year, we raised all the money for all the teams, and we paid the bills. And for 5 teams, that was $500,000. The net budget for iGEM right now is probably approaching $5 million a year, but that's distributed and raised locally. And so that transition happened very quickly. And be interesting to consider whether or not we could leverage that in support of this. It would instantly become a big event, right? It would be of order 2,000 people next year. And it probably wouldn't be a week, it'd be 5 days. And it's worth considering. I would ask the group here whether or not it's more important to couple down, if you will, to the undergraduates, or to couple out and up into the professional societies. And I feel like we're already doing an okay job with allowing for bottom-up participation here, and maybe via leveraging some of the architecture and infrastructure and lessons from BioSys Bio, we could strengthen that and make it more persistent. And thus it might be more important for us to do the next coupling into the world of a profession.
You talk about your experiences at food camps.
My experiences at food camps.
Because BioSys Bio, we realized at the last one how quickly it had become a rigid organization around a conference, and that if we weren't careful, we were going to lose much of that informality that we liked, and much of the self-organization. And so one of the comments that you made, Drew, about this meeting early on was that you'd like to see it have more of a food camp style where people come together and ideas form and it's spontaneous. And I think you also said in another recent email that it sort of didn't quite pan out that way. So do you want to?
I feel this gets a little bit off topic from the spirit of the discussion. I could do 30 seconds on it. Food Camp, Friends of O'Reilly, Tim O'Reilly and his colleagues at O'Reilly Publishing set up a meeting where they basically passed on working on the agenda, right? And so they just had a bunch of paper up on the wall, and they invited 200 interesting people, and then everybody would just write down what they want to talk about, and you'd have 6 parallel sessions in half-hour slots or an hour slot. And that works pretty well if you have interesting people who have never met each other before and you just want to get to know each other. But if you actually have things you're trying to accomplish, it's a nightmare. This has then gone over to Google, and Google and O'Reilly and Nature collaborate on a sister event called SciFu, and then there's all these parallel open source events, BARF or whatever. In setting this meeting up here, we tried to do a mix where sessions like this were community, specified, bottom up. We want to have a thing on professional organizations, right? But it's balanced with, we think we should, for various reasons, have these sorts of tracks and these sorts of talks.